The original Mass Effect trilogy was considered one of the greatest triumphs in video game storytelling that has ever been made. So when BioWare announced that they would be working on a spin-off continuation of the franchise, expectations were certainly always going to be high. When Andromeda finally released in 2017, it quickly became an internet laughingstock due to bad facial animations, uncharacteristically cringe dialogue, almost constant glitches, and a myriad of other issues. I think this Metacritic review summary encapsulates the majority opinion of the time though. It isn't bad so much as it is disappointing. For this video, I've replayed the game for the first time since release, not remembering much about it, and was surprised that there is a lot of good in this game, but it is drowned by a heavy ocean of expectation. Was there ever a world where BioWare could really have made a successor to the Mass Effect series that would live up to the name? And is this game as bad today, nearly a decade later, and after 2 more critical bombs from the studio? Could a modern player pick this up today, not knowing a thing about the release controversy, and find it worth playing? We will discuss all of this and more in this final piece of my Mass Effect retrospective series. There will be ample spoilers throughout this video, so if you are watching this in hopes of deciding whether or not to give this game a go for the first time, be warned. Though, I will make this statement right off the top. I can't imagine why somebody would play this game without previously playing the original trilogy, but I imagine that player would like Andromeda a lot more than longtime fans. If a random person stumbled upon this game today having no experience with Mass Effect, they may find it revolutionary, in the same way a person who has never played a Dragon Age game before Veilguard, and I know people who have done this, would like that game a lot. Ignorance is bliss, and without the preconceived expectations of the previous entries, Andromeda may have been much better received. But this is a holistic, contextual retrospective, so as a longtime fan of the series who played the game on release, I must evaluate this game in the world that it is in, not in a vacuum. All this to say, it is to Andromeda's unfair detriment that it holds the name Mass Effect. And to those that name means nothing to, honestly, this could be a great game for you. It tried to humanize and brighten the Mass Effect setting, but in doing so, loses a lot of what made its predecessors so great. For those of us who bear the burden of a great love for those that came before it, it is hard to call this game anything but a disappointment. Let's define why. In order to give this game a fair evaluation as a standalone product for the rest of this video, let's get this part out of the way because it does affect the version of the game that we experience today. Like Mass Effect 3, the backlash of the initial release was so powerful that BioWare was forced to go in and make adjustments in subsequent patches. But unlike Mass Effect 3, and more importantly, this game would begin a trend of being such a touchy subject that BioWare would abandon it beyond those few required patches dead in the water despite the game being primed for follow-up DLC content. Content that really was sorely needed. Veilguard would suffer the same fate many years later, but the trend began here. But why the backlash? In order to understand why fans were so mad, we need to understand what they were expecting. In many ways, this game is a reimagining of Mass Effect 1. It too bears the burden of beginning a new Mass Effect story. What made Mass Effect 1 so good as a origin point for the series was its ability to establish so much of the entire universe so effectively. In just the 10 to 20 hours of that game, we learn about the history of the galaxy as it is defined in 2183. Humans are a newcomer to the Galactic Council-controlled government, and we have the pleasure of being able to get to know the Asari, the Turians, the Solarians, the Quarians, the Elcor, the Hanar, the Volus, even the Geth, and the Protheans as we fight to learn more about the Reaper threat. In that game too, we're able to explore planets on the ground in the Mako, learning about the worlds through speaking with our diverse squad. And even though we don't fully understand why the elusive Reaper threat is happening yet, by the end of that game we know that they are coming, and they are powerful enough to wipe out entire civilizations that are far more advanced than ours. And we learn about their ability to indoctrinate even great minds like that of the Spectre Saren Charon and matriarch Benezia. And all this in the rinky-dink proprietary engine of pre-EA 2007 BioWare. Flash forward to a decade later, and despite the massive resources of EA's BioWare and the power of the Frostbite engine, Andromeda seems to take a step back on all of these aspects. We take with us from the Milky Way only 5 of the dozen or so alien species that we knew by the end of the original trilogy, that being the council races of the humans, Turians, Solarians, and Asari, and also some Krogan. Other species are alluded to being on their way, but never made it due to cancelled DLC. And to add to this, all of the faces are the same. Now that is an aspect I remember being really mad about back when this game came out. Even in Mass Effect 1, they had the decency to have some difference in facial features among individuals of a species. But in Andromeda, all non-humans share the same exact face model with different material variations, with the exception of the immediate squad members. Did they really think that we wouldn't notice that the Asari, who have human facial features, are all using the same face model? They couldn't even give Lexi, as a crew member played by a freaking Natalie Dormer, her own face. In the place of the Milky Way races, the only new friendly species are the Angara. The Ket are the new enemy race, but due to plot reasons, we can't really consider these different new species totally. So in terms of discovering new alien species, one of the great wonders of Mass Effect 1, we're taking a major step back. And the game is self-aware that this is a difference, with Vetra remarking that it seems so strange to be the only intelligent species in a system. Yes, how lonely it is to be a human with no alien besties in the real world, hence why I like to escape from my reality and get to know them in Mass Effect, right? Or at least I did. Here's where I'll insert that the squad, once again 6 members with 2 humans, 1 Asari, 1 old Krogan, 1 Turian, and 1 other, is certainly given much more attention than Mass Effect 1. But is it a unanimous improvement? That's a question for a later section. Then there is the Prothean stand-in race, the Remnant. Once again, we are borrowing the idea of the ancient, unknowable, more advanced species that is mysteriously not around anymore, but their technology is supporting life in Helios seemingly immensely. And there are some revelations about the Remnant in relation to the natives in the cluster, but despite playing the game yesterday, I couldn't tell you a thing about them. No convenient Remnant VI to explain to me how the Remnant came to disappear, to build up dread about the nothing villains of the Ket and the Archon. I'll expand upon this more in the narrative section later in the video, but do you see the parallels on the surface? Andromeda recycles a lot of concepts that Mass Effect 1 explored 10 years prior, but for some reason does them worse. The only aspect that is a certain unanimous improvement is the planetary exploration, which I should hope would be the case because it's really the whole shtick behind Andromeda. You are the Pathfinder instead of a Spectre, so you're still above the law, but the plot armor has a new name, exploring a great frontier to settle a new home for the Milky Way races in Andromeda. But I have to bring up a concept that I talk about in my brief video on why I think Veilguard failed fundamentally, because I think it's applicable to this game to a degree as well. In order for a sequel to be considered a success, it must do everything that its predecessor did and better and more. And by focusing on the aspects of Mass Effect that nobody really remembers, Andromeda was somewhat dooming itself from the foundational level. What people remember Mass Effect for is like 50% the grand narrative and 50% the companions and romance. But Andromeda makes itself about 10% narrative, 40% companion and romance, and 50% open world exploration. Do you see the disconnect? I'm sure what influenced that shift was the huge monetary success of Dragon Age Inquisition a few years prior, which also shifts the Dragon Age setting to more open world exploration, and also a more whimsical tone which Andromeda adopts. More on this in a bit. But in the case of Andromeda's reception, this change was just one of many that would cause the shaky foundational concept to crumble. Visually, Andromeda was also hampered by technical limitations of its time, especially with regard to human faces. Facial animations were an aspect that were deeply panned and still are the largest aging factor to this game. And I believe that's because of the direction of the Mass Effect series in trying to aspire to be photoreal. Once again, we will talk a little bit more about visuals specifically later, as this game does a lot well, but one would think that something as fundamental as the look of faces in a game that is largely supposed to be about dialogue would be handled with a little more care. So to sum this section up, it was weird how much this game ignored in terms of what was so fundamental to the greatness of its predecessors. From attention to facial variation, to plot importance, to things as simple as tone, Andromeda made so many shifts that it was a very jarring experience to players who had certain expectations of the Mass Effect franchise after investing so much emotionally into the original trilogy. And this is a shame because there are a lot of interesting concepts in Andromeda that we'll talk about, but the weight of expectation cuts its growth abruptly short. Speaking of that tonal shift, let's dive into the key change that makes Andromeda feel really different from the original trilogy to most players for the worse. As I said in my previous retrospectives, the protagonists of BioWare games play a huge part in setting and reflecting the tone of the games that they're in. For the tragic, dramatic, and cinematic setting of the original trilogy, Shepard acted as a classic stoic badass persona regardless of Paragon or Renegade affiliation. Conversely, for the hopeful and more whimsical nature of Andromeda, Ryder is a more uplifting and novice figure than the hardened N7 soldier Shepard. The game even kind of plays at this idea in the role of your father, who is a stoic and emotionally unavailable N7 soldier who was expected to lead the initiative as the Pathfinder, giving his life and symbolically passing on his helmet to you to finish what he started. And this change, I want to be clear, is not necessarily bad. It is an obvious symbolic shift away from the original series to differentiate Andromeda as its own story from the get-go. I find that in general, a lot of changes that make up Andromeda and its philosophy make a lot of sense on paper, but in their actual execution tend to stumble. This is also in the change from the Paragon Renegade system to the 4 tone options of emotional, logical, comical, and professional. In theory, these choices are far more human and realistic than the very dramatically contrasting options of the original. Paragon and Renegade, as a reminder, is not really good and evil, as Shepard must always be a hero. It's more like compassionate and trying to save every life possible versus pragmatic, the mission must come first, in theory. Though of course in practice it usually becomes nice versus asshole. So it is a reductive system that usually leads to players committing to one Shepard Sona for their entire game run, for point maxing reasons really, because committing to one had the best gameplay outcomes. But it was undeniably iconic. Paragon Shepards are very distinct in how they play from Renegade counterparts. The drama of the system was its great strength. There was a lot of difference in outcomes between the two lines of play. Meanwhile, although the expanded options for Ryder's dialogue are rooted in realism and less pressure to conform to an archetype and instead encourage more freedom in responses, this comes at the cost of Ryder feeling like anything distinct. Instead of the mega hero or mega asshole variants of Shepard, we get one mega dork Ryder. And I played the game mostly following logical and professional, but those little moments like flirting can deliver some of the most cringe lines imaginable, and they are cringe because they are human. Shepard was so powerful because they were not written or acted very humanly. They were written as an aspirational fantasy 2000s badass. Even the delivery of their lines was inhumanly level-headed. Ryder is intended to be less exceptional, more real and human, and their lines and delivery reflect that. And this choice could be loved by some, it's a matter of taste, but it is a shift away from the escapism fantasy that defined the original games. Furthermore, the framing of the narrative around the protagonist figures really shows the game's differences as well. The original Mass Effect trilogy is about war, the dread of it before it begins, and the immense cost of war once it finally hits in 3. It is a tragic story that can feel hopeless at times, with Shepard being a beacon of hope to potentially save the galaxy that is otherwise saturated with continual loss. So Shepard's stoic nature and relentless persistence through the battlefield makes sense for the setting. It's hard to be jolly when you're seeing colonists get melted into goo or your home planet being destroyed around you. Meanwhile, Ryder's inexperience and hopefulness is initially in contrast with the seeming disorder of the Andromeda Initiative, but despite the Ket being an annoying thorn in the side sort of antagonist, the story of Andromeda is about brighter futures. Shepard wasn't even sure that they would live to see tomorrow. Meanwhile, Ryder is a figure meant to lead the charge on an effort that is projected to get more and more cozy with each passing day. Both Shepard and Ryder are integral to their stories, and both are figures of hope, but Ryder is Andromeda's first hope to clear the way for greatness, while Shepard is the Milky Way's last hope for survival. Mass Effect Andromeda has some of the most fluid and dynamic combat that the series has ever seen, and it takes great care in letting a player dictate their playstyle however and whenever they see fit. No longer do you have a class from the get-go and stick with it. Now Ryder is able to make use of swappable combat profiles through their AI SAM link. The combat is intuitive, fluid, and pretty fun. Too bad this game is so bloated Inquisition style that the great gunplay gets diluted in the expanse of nothingness that litters the worlds of the Helios cluster. Instead of the Mako, we now have access to the much easier to drive Nomad to traverse the diverse landscapes that we are scouting to increase viability for colony outposts. That is what is intended to be the majority gameplay time sink of this game. Intended. But in my most recent replay, I did not place a single outpost besides the first one because it was not required for anything other than swag points. I cannot begin to emphasize how much I personally do not care about anything other than narrative and companion interaction, with maybe a little bit of combat to break it up. But again, the Pathfinder's outpost finding thing is the main driving concept for the gameplay in this game. So my personal preference on this is just my own problem, really. It's not the game's fault. For me, the most fun sections of this game to play through are the more classic Mass Effect style linear story and loyalty missions. I love to headshot my way through thoughtfully designed 20-minute sections that reward me with a little choice at the end. That's the perfect formula for me. I have no interest in scanning, collecting 10 feathers, going to 10 worlds to get one knick-knack on each to bring back to the Solarian who says thank you and gives me 10 credits at the end. It's just not for me. And in fact, I find the quest structure that this game likes to use, where you need to visit 5 worlds just to talk to someone at each stop, extra infuriating because of the menus in this game that are so horrible. So bad that they had to patch a fix to skip some of the useless slow zooming around the galaxy after launch because they got so many complaints. But there is still so much menu bloat in this game, it is shocking. Like, these menus are so deeply unintuitive and require 5 button presses just to exit sometimes. And I have to view a full movie cutscene to leave and then fly to another planet and then land on it and so on. It's so deeply unintuitive and frankly just poorly designed. The reason why the menus are so bloated is probably because of the extra crafting and other strange stuff they added to the experience that was popular during the time. Research points specific to different regions, development requiring materials that are also region specific, strike team missions that are time gated like the war table missions in Inquisition, points for opening up different cryo blocks based on who can do what for you. It's all kind of pointless number go up gameplay that I care about essentially not at all. It's all part of the incentive of the game to explore, because the more you explore, the more you can collect and the more you can research and the more you can craft, and your viability goes up and you can unlock more cryo blocks and so on. But if you are a player who loves checking boxes in your game worlds or exploring just for the sake of it, there is a lot of content in this game for you. And despite my personal protests, the game does reward the player for investing in and exploring the game. For example, a quest that seems really needlessly bloated in the form of the Memory Trigger Collection quest has some of the most rewarding Easter egg content in the entire game if you complete it. No spoilers on the end of that though, because it is pretty major, but that might be the one collectathon questline I recommend for the sake of the reward for longtime players. Visuals are an aspect of the game that was a major criticism during Andromeda's release. The facial animations and lifeless-looking eyes were an easy starting point for people who were interested in mocking the game because, if we're being honest, they're still mockable today. I played using the default Sarah Ryder face because, despite my best efforts to make something that looked better in the character creator, everything I made custom looked somehow worse. The faces in this game, and especially the female faces, look like if you sculpted a face with some butter that you warmed with your hands. Like, they look bad today and they look bad then. This is 2017 we're talking about. The Witcher 3 was out 2 years prior with much better looking faces. Heck, the faces in the original trilogy hold up better in many cases than the ones in this game. This is probably because the original trilogy tended to stylize or design aspects of the world a little more than Andromeda does, and I always say, realism will always age faster than stylization. Sarah Ryder's default face in particular was a point of heavy criticism from gamers at the time because, plainly put, they found her ugly. And I want to make it clear that she might not be the most objectively gorgeous woman in the real world, but I think her face is somehow one of the best looking they managed to make in the entire game. Yes, she ends up looking more human than like a space model, but that kind of reflects the spirit of the game, I think. I like looking at hotties as much as anyone else, but I'm not of the mindset to be offended at the look of a fuggo just because they exist. And Sarah isn't even ugly, she's just fine, I think. If she visually offends you, just don't play the game as her. The much bigger issue to me in this game is the facial animations. Often, the faces of Andromeda emote without moving the eye region at all, just the mouth. Other times, the faces are emoting so much that they look agonizing. To be honest, it's just strange how they handled faces in this game, with the lack of alien variety I mentioned earlier almost making sense with how limited their facial tools seem to be. But I have to say, otherwise this game holds up visually quite well. The vistas are beautiful, armor looks very distinct and complex, the remnant areas are very well designed. Lighting is pretty consistent in this one, but actually I think that the major spaces are not necessarily more beautiful than the original Mass Effect games, because sometimes the lighting in Andromeda loses a sense of depth to it. As in, sometimes even in the pre-rendered cutscenes, the lighting is so washed out and white that it makes the visuals more flat than spaces that we've seen in previous Mass Effects. I think what illustrates this point well is in the difference between the Presidium in Mass Effect 3, which is also a mostly white space, but has a lot more depth versus the Nexus docking area, which lacks contrast in comparison. I speculate this difference is technical in how Frostbite at the time handled things like global illumination, but I'm not sure on the technical side because I don't work in Frostbite. But this is something that jumps out to me as a lighting artist in particular as a negative point for the Andromeda visuals. Other, more stylized lighting spaces, like in the Remnant Vaults, do look great still, but once again, that's because they have a more stylized approach. And besides the buttery human faces, our more curated alien companions have designs that hold up well. Jaw looks great and very cared for as a model and as a design, and Drac and PB do too. Things like props are actually the most Mass Effect feeling things to me in this entire game world. Little things like crates and decor feel straight from the Milky Way, and ground spaces like the Nexus as being from the same time and place as the previous games in a way other things don't. Like, the armor is nice, but it feels distinctly Andromeda style, if that makes sense. I do have to bring up that somehow hipster fashion did make its way into the designs of Andromeda, with some pieces of clothing specifically really aging this game as being from 2017. When I saw this as a potential outfit for Ryder, my jaw just about hit the floor. Overall, the game basically holds up, except for the faces that take up the majority of the focus of the game when you're in dialogue, but just turn off the obnoxious film grain and it'll be fine. Let's finally talk about an aspect of Andromeda that I think gets closest to getting it right. It's clear that BioWare understands that relationships with companion characters are a driving force for their worlds, and this game is actually really brimming with content with the companions. We are back down to 6 like in Mass Effect 1, and I applaud this reduction because fewer companions means more time with and depth to each of them, theoretically. Just like in the original trilogy, we start the game with our human companions. They are similarly as mildly interesting as the ones in the past games as well. Cora Harper is like a weeaboo, but for Asari. Despite being human, she is very Asari first, having trained as a biotic commando prior to joining the Initiative. She was also intended to be the next in line to the Pathfinder after your father, making his decision to go over her head a small point of contention between you and her very early on. But she accepts it quickly because despite her personal achievements, she is quite comfortable relying on the word of others as gospel. She also likes to garden. She is somewhat interesting in that she touches on the concept of humans being impacted by other species as a kind of radical opposite to the Ashley type figure who is wary of outside influence. Where Ashley was stuck in the human-centric past to her detriment, Cora was able to thrive when looking to outside influence in the Asari. Then we have Liam, who is just kind of a cool dude. He was on a multicultural crisis response team prior to joining the Initiative, and all of his interests during the game tend to align with promoting intercultural exchange for the betterment of everyone in ways that skirt the rules, with mixed results. If we're being honest, I don't really know what lesson we're supposed to learn from Liam, or what kind of question his character asks. Like, Cora's lesson was that you shouldn't idolize people, even hot, mysterious blue people, because idol worship is a sin, I guess? I suppose Liam reflects the everyman spirit of those who support the Initiative, like the idea of the betterment of all through intercultural exchange. So I guess that is the thesis of the previous games wrapped into one guy. Maybe that's why he had his couch shipped from a galaxy away, because he's so chill and also encapsulates the old world ideals. I don't know. He really likes walking around with no shirt on though. PB is quirky. She is our Asari representation on the crew, but also kind of a wild child. She's interested in doing what nobody else has done before, so she came to Andromeda to discover something new. She has a vested interest in remnant tech, and we recruit her amid her questing to open a remnant vault. Her loyalty mission, however, is about handling her toxic ex that is after her remnant discoveries, just kind of for the sake of messing with her. She's really all over the place, if we're being honest. I bet she was conceived somewhat as the anti-Liara, maybe to separate Andromeda from the original trilogy further. She's hectic, non-committal, and just around for a good time and adventure. She's not really here to tell us about the Asari lore as a representative because she doesn't care, even foregoing the use of her Asari-sounding name Pelisaria and butting heads with our more classically, in quotes, Asari crew doctor. Drac is an old, cranky Krogan who has lived long enough to have seen the Krogan rebellions back in the Milky Way. He is such a classic grandpa that he literally says things like "back in my day" semi-frequently in dialogue with the other squad mates. But his hook is that he came with his granddaughter, Kesh, who is actually the superintendent of the Nexus, despite a large majority of the Krogan breaking away from the Nexus Society some time ago. Drac, really Knackmore Drac, is interested primarily in making a home in Andromeda for the Krogan people, believing the Krogan culture of the Milky Way to be long destroyed. Whereas Rex was a revolutionary interested in changing the old ways, Drac is more of a reflection of the classic pre-self-destruction family values of the Krogan clans. He's pretty much a sweetheart though, really. Vetra is a Turian who acts as our back alley connection. She's always vague about who she knows and how, but she can get any job done or anything that we might need. Just don't ask her any questions. Her main concern, however, is in her little sister Sid, who she brought along with her to Andromeda and who she basically raised. She's been careful to not bring Sid into the seedy world she thrives in, but of course the nature of raising a child in shadow is that they will be desperate to seek the light. Sid tries to use Vetra's name to have some missions of her own, but Vetra's loyalty mission involves saving Sid from her slip-up, while also showing Vetra that Sid is more capable than she gives her credit for. Vetra can be quite guarded and demure, but she also has a soft heart. Jal is our representation of the Angaran people, the new race introduced in this game. Because he is part of this new species, he's the only squad mate that really encapsulates the classic Mass Effect role of the squad mate, which is to represent his group as a whole. The Angaran people are emotional and open and free-feeling, and so too is Jal. He speaks poetically and honestly, and doesn't really get human joking quite yet. He's a tinkerer, inquisitive, and prior to his time with the Tempest, he was actually quite aimless, despite belonging to the Angaran resistance faction. The Resistance is their major force against the cat, who they have been fighting for over 80 years now. His loyalty mission involves rescuing some of his siblings, of which he has hundreds, as is typical of the it takes a village approach to family that the Angaran like, from the Rokar. The Rokar are basically a xenophobic, as in anti-Milky Way alien faction of Angaran, that are interested in destroying Milky Way presence in the previously Angaran-only Helios cluster. Of course, in the end though, through his sheer big heart, Jal manages to basically dismantle the Rokar force. Mic drop, take that, racism. And then there are the additional crewmates. Suvi is a human who is interested in science despite deeply believing in a divine god creator. Callow is the Solarian pilot who was on the team that originally built the Tempest, so his entire plotline involves conflict with Gil, who handles the actual technical maintenance needs of the Tempest now. Gil's plot, however, involves being a gay man whose bestie is in charge of fertility, so he decides to have a baby with her. Lexi Tapero is our Asari doctor who specializes in alien biology and maintains the physical and mental well-being of the entire crew, while also being self-conscious about appearing unfeeling. And let me say this now, me not being able to romance Lexi Tapero is the greatest sin this game commits. I want her so bad, you have no idea. And the worst part is that she talks about why she won't date me several times. Makes me want to cry. But on a more serious note, the companions of this game are interesting in that they feel less like reflections of a concept and more like actual people. The functions of companions in older BioWare games was to act as a point of communication that reflects some greater group or race. Like in Mass Effect 1, where every character was explicitly there to teach the player about some faction or school of thought in the game universe. But these guys don't really have major affiliations to the same degree. Their own stories tend to come first. And I think that is another deliberate differentiator that respects the spirit of Andromeda, which is that your previous life and previous racial affiliations and previous prejudices cannot matter anymore in Andromeda. You are an Asari or a human or a Solarian, but more importantly, you're a pioneer with the Andromeda Initiative. So yes, they all have their own stories and experiences that make them unique, but their general vibe is more distinctly united force of randoms rather than a curated representative council. Though this is another time that I like an idea that Andromeda explores more on paper than in practice. The companions are interesting enough, I suppose, but once again, feel less interesting or iconic because they are not deeply embroiled in individual representations of greater conflict. Once again, Cora, as an example, has the plot of liking the Asari a lot, and her major lesson is a warning against idol worship. Compare this to the plot of a companion like, say, Miranda from 2, another human companion who's also a biotic and a second in command. But Miranda asks much bigger questions than Cora does. Miranda's story involves concepts like human genetic modification, ownership of DNA versus ownership of the self. What does it mean to be created and to have a creator? Can she be mad about being an engineered thing if she is a beautiful, well cared for, perfect on paper woman? Can she ever have children of her own? Is her body her own? Do you see what I'm getting at with this? The companions are less representative, but they're also less thought-provoking in this game. I appreciate how much time we get to spend with the cast, I just wish the cast said more. I may not be able to pursue Lexi Tapero, the true apple of my eye, but there is still actually a ton of romance content in this game. For reference, I am a woman who is pretty deeply lesbian, and given that I only played this game once on release and I romanced Jal, I went into this playthrough with an open mind and heart to see how my adult brain would feel about the romance options. I flirted pretty much with everyone that even had a slight chance with me, including Jal because why not, and was delighted to see how many options I had as a woman who was primarily interested in pursuing women. But I have to be honest, for my personal taste, choosing who to romance in this game was kind of hard in the end and not really in a good way. To be fair, I do have very particular taste when it comes to romances, but the ones in this game all had something just a little off for me. Like, they were not egregiously bad, just maybe not for me. I heavily considered Suvi because of her charming accent, but alas, I'm not really that interested in the whole religion thing. But more importantly, the face card is just not it for me, and the lack of content, but like, compare the Sarah Suvi face card against Shepard and Liara, and we're talking worlds apart literally. I'd like to think that I'm not that shallow, but the buttery faces in this game put any human really at a disadvantage for me looks-wise. Vetra is sweet, though I'm not the most interested ever in being a stepmom to Sid. She would have been my second choice, but I'm not really that attracted to the bird look, and she also has no sex scene. That is so lame, because one of the greatest achievements of Andromeda is that it bravely shows full, sweaty nudity. I cannot miss out on that. Jal is so sweet, and I remember his romance actually being quite beautiful, but alas, I saw the scene with him shirtless, and you know what? Had to tap out there. Sorry, I sound so shallow, but really, love is not blind. And thus, through process of elimination, I committed to PB. My taste aligns more traditionally with Lexi, or of course my actual wife Liara, but PB does have a nice foaming at the mouth to touch you quality to her post-loyalty romance content that I like well enough. And her final romance scene where they show a depiction of what the mind meld looks like and the overlapping I love you is pretty cool for a sorry-mancers like me. I don't love that her loving you means sacrificing her nomadic nature. It's kind of up in the air though, because it's also implied that she's just like that because she's running away from her past, and now that she's found a home with you, she doesn't have to run anymore. Aww, that's cute, but I don't know. It's not my favorite trope, but it's okay. If you're a male writer, your choices are similar, except you do have access to Gil, who I've heard has one of the most shockingly fast-paced romances imaginable, coinciding with his baby plot. Or Cora, who has one of the most graphic sex scenes these guys have ever made. Like, you can't watch it on YouTube graphic. We're talking full-on pounding. Hey, you know what? That's great. Veilguard needed that. I'll also note that this game has a interesting, strange view of polyamory. I did commit to have the documentarian Carrie as a side piece, who said that she could be discreet, and she's on the lookout for whoever you're normally with. But PB is actually also like a fully poly-romantic option, so I'm sitting there like, Carrie, you're being shady for nothing. I think there are one or two other side pieces in the game who you can commit to cheating on your partner with and they're cool about it, but honestly I find this insane. Like, the way that they talk about them being poly, it's just them cheating. It's not true polyamory. It's also strange because romancing PB, who is poly, and then having an unsanctioned mistress is a strange disconnect, Like, what's the message here? Romantic content is always going to be the most subjective aspect to these games because you love who you love. For me, this cast is a cool group of chillers, but nobody really sets my heart aflame that they'll let me romance anyway. But it's okay. I'll always be thankful for my time in Mass Effect 3 with Liara. Narrative in this game compared to the previous entries is like comparing being hand-fed grapes while being massaged and serenaded to a wet fart. There are enough main plot missions where you actually engage with the antagonists that you can count them on one hand, and you begin the game with roughly the same amount of information on them that you end the game with. The Archon is a drop of water compared to the vast seas of complexity in figures like Saren or even the Elusive Man. He's much more akin to Corypheus from Dragon Age Inquisition, where they're both just kind of creepy weirdos who are doing evil for the sake of it. The Reapers were some of the most iconic and dreadful and imposing villains that I have ever encountered in any media. But in Andromeda's defense, that's because we had 3 games to slowly uncover their secrets. Andromeda seems like it's pussyfooting around some greater thing going on with the Ket and the Remnant, but it does little to inspire any of those great moments of fear and wonder that Mass Effect 1 was able to do with the Reapers. We begin with the simple premise of coming to Andromeda to explore it pioneer style, and this cowboy Wild West concept was something that BioWare leaned into heavily in pre-release marketing material. In practice, it feels Wild West basically, not even a little bit, but the sentiment is noted. And here is where I'll make a statement about how the game handles the previous world state choices. I forgive it. I am far more inclined to accept that there will be little to no reference to the previous Mass Effect games because the world of Andromeda establishes itself very logically to me. The arcs left before the Reaper threat was confirmed to be real to the masses. There were rumors about a crazy specter named Shepard claiming they were coming, but the Council was working hard to reject those claims, if you recall. Through the memories that we unlock, we come to find out that the secret benefactor in charge of funding the whole move to Andromeda was spooked by something and wanted everyone out ASAP. And of course, we know that it was the Reaper invasion, but nobody on the Arks has a clue. And once we arrive 600 years later and a galaxy away, it makes perfect sense that we would be a little out of range to hear about what the fate of the crew of the Normandy and the Milky Way ended up being. So all this to say, the game justifies itself very valiantly to not have to consider a single choice made in the prior games, and yet it still does attempt at every logical opportunity to make references to the people and places of the previous entries, which I appreciate. Compare this to the handling of the world state of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, which takes place in the same damn continent with the same damn characters just 10 years later, and it still doesn't care to reference the world state that directly involves those characters. And you know what? Comparatively, Andromeda is a breath of fresh air. So back to the actual plot. It's basically that these Ket weirdos have been fighting the nice Angara for a long time, and the Angara don't really know why, but it is revealed that the Ket are turning the Angara and other species like the Krogan into Ket as their form of reproduction. Converting other species that they view as lesser into new evil versions of themselves as reproduction. Where have we heard of that before? Meanwhile, the Archon is trying to hunt you down because you have been able to access and interface with these remnant vaults that are able to do incredible things like alter a planet's entire ecosystem. That's right, the Ket are not the remnant, and they want to control the remnant technology, but they can't. And they use the Angara to reproduce, but the Angara are later revealed to be a creation of the remnants. So where do the Ket come from? I don't know. Beats me. Anyway, the Archon manages to capture you and inject you with something, and from that he discerns that the reason you can interface with the remnant tech is because of Sam, the handy-dandy AI that you live in symbiosis with. So the Ket try to take over the Ark Hyperion, which is where Sam's main core lives, to try to take over Sam. But in doing so, it is revealed that actually you can interface with remnant technology without Sam for some reason. But it hurts more when you do it without Sam for some reason. Your twin, who has been recovering on the Hyperion while you've been out pathfinding, must save the day and your life by disrupting the Archon's plans and restoring your connection with Sam. And I gotta say, I'm actually a sucker for the whole twin is the one you didn't pick and is their own character gimmick. I actually think it's really neat. Maybe a little underutilized in this game, but neat. So then you team up with all the allies you've made along the way to save the day and stop the Hyperion from being destroyed as it's hijacked and brought to the remnant-made planet and center of all their tech, Meridian. Now this part to me was a little laughable because I, at this point, had done almost no side content besides companion quests, so I had no outposts besides Prodromos and very little in terms of tangible allies who were not my immediate besties. And I seem to face no penalty for this. I find that a little shocking because in other BioWare games that want to set up a grand finale, they tend to accentuate the need to acquire allies and invest in the world. But Andromeda's finale doesn't seem to care very much about that. It reflects how underbaked the whole main story is, in that it can be so disconnected from the actual game world that I have worked, or in my case, not worked, to build up. It's actually beneficial to me because I do not want to engage in the game setting that they worked so painstakingly on, but you would think that they would want to encourage a little more engagement like they do in every other game they've made. You have your final boss battle with the Archon, where he is using your twin Sam connection against you, so while you're doing the running around, you have to watch your twin suffer in the torture chair and battle the Archon's big tentacle. Now, this can't help but invoke to me the memory of the human Reaper fetus battle at the end of 2, and in doing so, once again cheapens this instance in comparison. That battle was so amazing and epic in scale because of not only the visuals of the horror of the human Reaper that is still being born by melting down millions of innocent colonists, it's also conceptually horrific because now we see how all the Reapers before were made. It implies limitless suffering through time to create the masses of Reapers that we see cause so much destruction throughout the series. It looks shocking, and it is shocking. And the Archon's tentacle is just such a hollow battle in comparison. It looks worse and it matters so much less. In the end, the Archon perishes, and it is implied that there are other Ket that will continue the crusade of whatever it is they want. We still don't really know. The issue of the Scourge, which are dark energy masses that have been causing problems for the whole game, is unresolved and still unexplained. It's implied to be from the remnant cities we visit, but we don't really know anything. But they do reward us with a little shepherd dance at the final party, and you know what? That makes it all worth it. It's clear that all of this was meant to be a setup for continuations that never came, and that's a shame, really. It's a shame for a team to pour their heart and soul into a product that dares to be different and to be met with such immense vitriol that they are unable to expand upon the game to its benefit. But we have to acknowledge that the plot of this game, beyond the initial starting point of leaving the Milky Way, as in all the Ket and Remnant stuff really, is all very borrowed feeling, which is a disappointment because the premise of being in a completely new galaxy has limitless creative potential in the stories that could have been told. Instead, we end up with a narrative that has no clear point or thesis or obvious reasons why I should care beyond trying to make Andromeda more livable. It is probably the most disappointing aspect of Andromeda because it was one of the most engaging parts of the original trilogy. Andromeda is not a bad game, but it is to me the worst Mass Effect game. When you're competing with the best ever, it might even be a compliment to be considered among them. But Andromeda is only considered because it shares the name. When the Arcs left the Milky Way, they left behind the perils of war that led to some of the greatest dramatic storytelling in any game ever. When they landed in the Helios cluster, they found the potential of a new galaxy before them and decided that the greatest thing that this could bring was the ability to run around and shoot. We left behind the wonderment and beauty of an established, diverse, and rich with fresh concepts society, and instead found a Wild West with less diversity, less thought-provoking, and worse-looking faces. Andromeda does have a lot that it tries in order to shake up the Mass Effect formula, but it suffers because it is attempting to reinvent the wheel, the dialogue wheel. It is more human and real, but in pivoting this way, it loses the beautiful otherworldly fantasy that defines sci-fi and the original Mass Effects. It cares about delivering interesting worlds, but loses its interest in people and politics and theming. Mass Effect 3 dared to scream that the greatness and evolution of society demanded intercultural exchange. Andromeda accepts this concept as fact and then forgets to scream anything at all. If you're interested in just running around with your besties and flirting and fighting and exploring and seeing numbers go up, then there is a ton here for you. But if the core appeal of the name Mass Effect to you is in its drama and emotional depths of narrative and choice, I don't see you loving or even liking Andromeda. BioWare at this very moment has one last Mass Effect in them. Their entire Dragon Age team has been laid off, leaving behind only a small team dedicated to creating one last Mass Effect adventure. And I say last because the studio has trended toward focusing on the wrong parts of their games for the last 10 years of their own volition. We as consumers tend to give developers who work under corporate overlords the benefit of the doubt, which is good. Often there are shackles of corporate oversight that can hurt the creative process. But after 10 years of mediocrity and listening to the devs say, no, we wanted to make Anthem. We wanted to have the fighting arena in our narrative game. We fought for it. We wanted to dedicate resources to multiplayer in Mass Effect. I hear these statements and I shudder. It sends chills down my spine to think that they spend precious resources diluting the core appeal of their games and relying on reusing aspects of their successes without understanding what made them successful on a holistic level. You cannot copy aspects of Mass Effect 2 thinking that what made the game was the end mission. What made the game was the whole game. Tight 20 to 30 minute gameplay sections that padded an experience that was otherwise all about choice and dialogue and story and romance. Not 15-minute dialogue breaks to hours of meaningless exploration. I have been asked what I would do if I was in charge of the studio by friends who hear me complain about this direction, and my answer is always that I want them to make just one step above visual novels. And really, that's what the original Mass Effects were: combat and exploration that breaks up the meat of the experience, not combat as the experience. I hope and I pray and I beg, but I do not expect that BioWare will listen to this plea. I know another Mass Effect is coming eventually, and I know that when it does, I will play it, but only time will tell if they will learn from their shortcomings from the last decade, starting with this game. Thank you for watching and engaging, and stay tuned. I imagine it will be quite a while before I make another video of this style, but there will be lots of other gaming content to come.